Imagine walking through a city where the smell of fresh bread mixes with the stench of open sewers, where a king lives in unimaginable luxury, just miles away from people who haven't eaten in 3 days, where the most beautiful buildings in the world stand right next to the darkest, most dangerous alleys in human history. This is not a fairy tale. This is Paris, 1780. In the 1700s, Paris was unlike any city on earth. With over 600,000 people packed inside its walls, every king in Europe wanted to copy Paris. Every artist wanted to live in Paris. Every philosopher wanted to think in Paris. On one side, you had the Paris of the rich. Wide, clean boulevards, magnificent stone buildings, elegant cafes where philosophers debated. And on the other side, just steps away, you had the Paris of the poor. Narrow streets, so dark that sunlight never reached the ground, two completely different worlds. And the tension between these two worlds was building. Every single day, to understand 1700s Paris, you must first understand something that seems almost impossible to believe today. There were no street numbers. The average street in central Paris was less than 10 feet wide. Yet through these streets, horses, carriages, merchants with carts, street vendors, beggars, nobles, soldiers, all pushed through together. The noise was absolutely deafening. Vendors screaming their prices, horses clopping on stone, and the smell. Historians who have studied 18th century Paris consistently describe the smell as overwhelming. The wealthy dealt with this by traveling in enclosed carriages, high above the street level. The poor had no such luxury. They walked through it every single day. Despite all of this, despite the noise, the chaos, the darkness, Paris had an energy that visitors from across Europe described as absolutely electric. By 1750, Paris had over 1,800 cafes. And these were not simply places to drink coffee. These were the internet of the 18th century. The most famous of these cafes was the Café de Procope, still standing today, making it the oldest continuously operating cafe in the entire world. Voltaire, the writer who challenged the church and the king with equal ferocity, had his own personal table here. It is said he drank 40 cups of coffee per day. And what did they talk about? They talked about freedom, about equality, about whether kings had any right to their power at all. These were not safe conversations. In 1700s France, saying the wrong thing about the king could get you imprisoned in the Bastille, without trial, without explanation. Benjamin Franklin, yes, the American founding father, sat in this very cafe during his time in Paris. And the ideas were too powerful to stop. To understand why Paris exploded in revolution, you must understand Versailles. Versailles was not simply a palace. It was a statement. The Hall of Mirrors, 240 feet long, lined with 357 mirrors, was designed for one purpose only: to make visitors feel small. And it worked. Every single moment of the king's day was a ceremony. Waking up, ceremony. Getting dressed, ceremony. Hundreds of nobles competed for the honor of handing the king his shirt. In 1788, France had one of the worst harvests in a century. The price of bread rose to the point where a working family was spending 80 to 90% of their entire income just on bread. While Louis XVI lived in this impossible luxury, Paris was falling apart. The burden of debt fell entirely on the poor. And then came the bread crisis. Paris in the 1700s was a city of extraordinary diversity. At the very top were the aristocrats, less than 2% of the population. Below them, the bourgeoisie. The nobles wore silk and velvet. They attended the opera. They spoke in elaborate, formal French that was almost a different language from what ordinary people spoke. The bourgeoisie, merchants, lawyers, doctors, were educated people who read Voltaire and Rousseau. People who believed they deserved more political power. And then at the bottom, the sans-culottes, the bakers, cobblers, laundry workers, street vendors, the people who built Paris with their hands every single day. And these were the people who would tear it down. A woman named Marie wrote in a letter that she had not given her children a full meal in 6 days, that she had sold everything she owned, that she no longer feared death because death would at least bring silence. Marie is not famous. You will not find her in history books, but she represents hundreds of thousands of Parisians who lived and suffered in these streets. On July 14, 1789, a crowd of Parisians, armed with whatever they could find, stormed the Bastille prison. Not because there were many prisoners inside, there were only 7, but because the Bastille represented everything they hated: royal power, arbitrary imprisonment. The streets that had seen centuries of royal processions now saw revolutionary marches. The cafes where philosophers had debated freedom in theory now saw people demanding it in practice. The Paris of powdered wigs and candlelit ballrooms and elaborate court ceremonies was over. A new Paris was being born, and the world would never be the same. When we look at old paintings and drawings of pre-revolutionary Paris, we are looking at a world that was simultaneously the most sophisticated and the most unjust in European history. Today, Paris is one of the most visited cities in the world. Tourists walk down the Champs-Élysées. They visit Versailles. They stand in front of Notre Dame. They sit in cafes, perhaps even the Café de Procope, without knowing that 250 years ago, men were having conversations that changed the entire course of human history. Baron Haussmann, in the 1800s, demolished most of the medieval street network we walked through today. He replaced it with the wide, elegant boulevards that tourists photograph every single day. But if you look carefully, if you find the old corners, the hidden courtyards, the streets that Haussmann somehow missed, you can still feel it. That energy, that tension. Paris always feels like something enormous is about to happen. Maybe that is its greatest gift to the world. Thank you for walking these streets with me today.